and welcome to an all-new episode in podcast Azim Premji University. I'm Harini Nagendra, and I head the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability at the university. The episodes you find in this series are curated from our Let's Talk Climate Change public lecture series organized by Azim Premji University in Bangalore and Bhopal. This series, the Let's Talk Climate Change public lecture series, brings to you interesting and informative deep dive lectures on issues of climate change, conservation, and ecology by a range of people: researchers, policy makers, practitioners, educators, journalists, and other kinds of people who are all subject matter experts of one kind or another. In the very first episode of this series, you listen to Chandi Prasad Bhatt, very well known for his exceedingly important work on the Himalayas in terms of protection, action on the ground, talk about Himalayan sensitivity. In this episode, we have Professor Mahesh Rangarajan as a speaker. A researcher, author, and historian, Professor Rangarajan teaches history and environmental studies at Ashoka University in Sonipat, Haryana. He's also chair of the Ashoka Archives of Contemporary India. It's a great pleasure to have him here. Mahesh finished his PhD in 1992 from Oxford University and did one of the best theses, which was on the importance of the tiger as a symbol for conservation in India, and later a book which also came out from this thesis. That talked about how the history of conservation has been a long history which integrates issues of politics, economics, and the idea of India as a developing economy and the position it wanted to take in the world. What we think of as purely ecological issues of tiger numbers actually mean much more to us. That symbolizes who we are as a country, and that has also been Mahesh's trajectory. He was already working as a journalist even before he started his PhD. After completing his PhD at Oxford, he came back to India and took up a position at Nehru Memorial Library. Many of you may have seen him as a very seasoned psephologist on TV who looked at the history of electoral politics in India and therefore helped people interpret what we saw in terms of politics. And I think that understanding and interpreting real political change, what the compulsions are that drive politics, and relating that to history and to ecology is a very unusual combination. We certainly don't have anyone in India quite like him. Mahesh has taught at Delhi University. He was a vice chancellor at CRIA and has spoken and taught at Cornell and many distinguished universities in India and outside. He's edited a number of different volumes on conservation, looking at it from a broader perspective. And I think he's one of the best speakers I know. He's simply unsurpassed in his capacity to weave in very disparate threads which are actually connected in ways that we don't understand. Without further adu, it is my privilege to invite Professor Mahesh Rangarajan to deliver this lecture in our Let's Talk Climate Change series.
Thank you, Professor Nagendra. I think that was an excellent introduction, though I do think you went overboard in introducing me. I have been compared to many things, but this was the first time magic carpet and Aladdin came to mind. I firstly want to acknowledge it's a great honor and privilege to be here at the Bangalore International Center. Not for the first, hopefully not the last time, with an audience as distinguished and serious as this one. Both Azim Premji University and Bangalore International Center be complimented for having taken the initiative for this series on talking climate change. I really liked also the fact that we began with a very important point, that climate change is about more than just climate change. Often in today's public debate, the ones which happen outside the social media, we all love the social media, but it tends to reduce things to whether you're for or against something. So do you really think the climate is changing or not? Are you a climate change denier or are you an alarmist? That would how it would get framed. But I think aside from that and away from that, there is a very important set of public debates happening across the world. These have been overshadowed by events of the last few years. One of the big debates, and it's very important we are meeting in the year 2022, is that in the last half century or so, the issue of how we make peace with nature has come to be very significant, perhaps as significant as the question of how we make peace among people. The 20th century ended only about 2 decades ago. There were many things about the 20th century we know, but one of the sad facts of the 20th century is that 200 million people lost their lives in wars, revolutions, civil wars, and armed conflicts. By 1945, it was evident that the League of Nations had failed to maintain the peace. And if you recall, the United Nations was founded to banish forever the scourge of war and to try to get the nations of the world where they differed, and they often do, to try to negotiate. In 1972, something as important as the founding conference of the UN took place, from my viewpoint, which was the first international conference of the human environment. And it took place in a remarkable city, Stockholm, one of the few great European cities spared the ravages of the 30 Years' crisis, which included the wars we know as the First and the Second World War. Stockholm was a very important moment. There were only two heads of government in Stockholm. Olof Palme, who would tragically be assassinated some years later. The Prime Minister of Sweden was there, but he had to be. And the only other head of government who bothered to turn up was the Prime Minister of India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi. Now, you're all aware of the significance of the various conferences of the human environment which have been held since then. Johannesburg, Paris, Copenhagen, and several others. But I think it's significant that when we talk of this notion of a peace with nature, we can't de-link it from the question of peace among people. Look at events over the last few years which have, in a sense, put the issue of climate change on the back burner. You can't today look at the news without hearing about the progress, if that is the word, of the conflict in the Ukraine. The war between Russia and the Ukraine, which in part is also an undeclared conflict between Russia and the United States and its allies. One consequence of this is that in the US, there is much more emphasis on developing fossil fuels to make America self-reliant. We associate this with its former president, Donald Trump, who was very clearly a climate change denier. And we do not associate it with the present president, Mr. Biden, whose party, among other things, in its campaign to win the presidency 2 years ago, embraced the idea of what they called a Green New Deal. But right now, that's moved a little to the back burner. We're back to looking at coal, fracking, much more emphasis on fossil fuels. It's a similar picture in Europe. Germany, which led the way in phasing out nuclear power, in giving renewables enormous significance, now finds that it is moving away from a reliance on natural gas supplies from Russia. Natural gas is a cleaner form of energy than coal or oil, but it's moving back to fossil fuels. There is a lot of debate about the role of India and China, and I'm sure you'll all agree that both countries have taken huge steps to increase renewables, but both, for various historical reasons, continue to depend and will continue to depend for the foreseeable future on coal and oil. We therefore are in a situation where the international competition between states leads them to acknowledge the significance of climate change. The last conferences which were held, the last one was in Glasgow. There's one beginning in Sharm el-Sheikh. In fact, the timing of this talk is it's around 10 days before the COP27, which is to be held at Sharm el-Sheikh. But I think we would all agree that at this moment, the divisions between the different nation states are so deep that it's difficult to see the kinds of objectives that were laid out in Paris being fulfilled. Forget about keeping the extent of rise in global temperatures within 1.5 degrees. We are not even sure if 2 degrees will be possible, let alone net zero by 2050, for which carbon emissions of today, I'm quoting the UN reports, would have to be halved. It's looking very difficult to attain that. This is why I think history matters. Let me share with you an anecdote. During the PhD, you tend to spend some time reading the newspapers. And in the days before newspapers were on the web, you read the physical paper. I still do. It's a fascinating ad which I should have kept. It said, you're in the army as a major, your unit is under fire, the radio is not working, help is far away, 3 men are wounded, and you're running out of cover, the enemy is advancing. Do you really think an MA in history will help now? I don't remember what it said, but I'll try and give you a sense. And it's in an MA in history will not help. It won't help you get fresh ammunition. It won't help you contact headquarters. It won't tell you how to give succor to the wounded or stop the adversary. But what it will do is to train you how to think. And it went on to say that the army is looking for people who are fit, but we're looking for men and women who know how to think. And one of the advantages of the historical craft, surely, is that it is about stories. And these are stories with a purpose. They are stories which are grounded in the reality of today. We know where we stand. But how did we get here? What are the various turns in the road which led us to this particular crossroads? We all know we live in epochal times. They're epochal because since 1945, there has been no worldwide conflagration. The period from 1945 to 73 was a golden age of economic growth. The great historian John McNeill has argued that it's after 1945 that we saw something which economic historians call the Great Acceleration, a surge not only in human numbers, but a surge in economic growth. So if you look at the 20th century to come back, the number of people on Earth at the beginning of the century and later was vastly different. There were 4 times as many people living on Earth by 2000 as they were in 1900. But if you look at economic growth, the world economy was 14 times the size it was in 1900. This economic transformation was unevenly distributed. We all know that. But what is also important is this marvelous transformation of economies not only produced wealth, it also produced waste. So the 20th century was also a time when humans managed to take new technologies to places and levels which it had never reached before. There are many debates about the Anthropocene, when it did and did not begin. And I'm aware that in 1995, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist Paul Crutzen was to go on to argue that the Anthropocene is a specific historical epoch. It's not an era, it's not a period, it's not a few centuries, it's an entire epoch. And this epoch, he said, is defined by humans acquiring the power of a geological force. I don't know how many of you watch old Hindi films. I was a great fan of Utpal Dutt. Utpal Dutt acted in a film called Bahurani, in which the prospective bridegroom was to be asked lots of questions. I'll translate for those who don't know Hindi. And he was asked, Agar Himalaya na hota, to kya hota? If the Himalaya didn't exist, what would happen? And the correct answer was, Agar Himalaya na hota, to Hindustan mein barish nahi hoti aur hamara desh registan hota. If the Himalaya didn't exist, India would be a desert because the clouds would go off to the Tibetan plateau. So the Tibetan plateau is in the rain shadow of North India. We don't like admitting it, but it is. And one of the reasons is that the Himalayas are rising at the rate of 0.5 centimeter a year. I just saw a young man wearing a monkey cap, and I was telling Professor Nagendra that it's nice to see people wearing monkey caps, because whenever I do in winter in Delhi, everybody, even small kids, laugh at me. I see no reason why they should. But one of the reasons we wear monkey caps in North India is that the Himalaya also has an effect on the heat and cold cycles of North India. And I think it's very important to remember this notion of geological force is comparing the human impact to the kinds of forces that have created the Himalaya when these huge tectonic plates clashed of India with the rest of Asia. What is the idea then of humans acquiring this kind of force? When did we acquire it and how? And the conventional date, which Crutzen suggested, no prizes for guessing, is the late 18th century. Sorry to take you back to school textbooks, but in the 1760s, 70s, 80s, there's this cluster of changes which takes place in England. There's James Watt, there's a range of changes, the application of steam and the mining of underground coal to unlock the energy in that coal would transform England within a space of 70, 80 years into something which China is today, the workshop of the world. So wherever you were in the world, after 1815, the seas of the world were ruled by the British. Britain was the world's first superpower. From 1815 to 1945, it ruled the waves. We just went through the coronation of an English king, and we have had 2 prime ministers, and that song, Britannia, Britannia, Britannia ruled the waves. It actually meant something. What we tend to forget is that empire was to be powered by coal. And the control of coal would be particularly important because the British were the first people on earth, or the English rather, to mine coal from underground. Why were they the first to get there? The conventional story we all heard, which I'm sure you know, is because of this cluster of inventions, capital, technology, innovation, and so on. That's true. But if you were to look at the world of 1700, you could be forgiven not to be expecting such a transformation to happen in England. As you're aware, in 1700, China and India accounted for 50 to 60% of the world's GDP. If you looked at manufacturers, India accounted for about 25% of them. Southern China was an area where people had burnt coal for centuries. There's remarkable work by Ken Pomeranz called The Great Divergence, which shows us that in China, they did not have the kind of labor shortages and energy shortages that England had. So there's a cluster of secular factors which got together to put England in front. It wasn't preordained. The other, which is a very important point about coal, is that in the 1830s and 40s, when coal really begins to spread within the British Isles, in the United Kingdom, not just in UK, but also in parts of Scotland, people who had the capital preferred coal. Not because it was cheaper, but it was easier to control labor. Remember, this was a time of very intense conflicts between those who owned capital and workers. This is long before many of the welfare measures we associate with industrial capitalism had come into play. Remarkable new work by Andreas Malm shows that though water power was actually cheaper, it would have involved huge investments in housing, which nobody was willing to make, or at least the people with money were not willing to make, and they opted for coal. So, we are living through a period when you have large factories, which employ far fewer people than they would have 10 or 20 years ago, because they're so mechanized. Well, that process really begins in a very major way in the 1830s and 40s in England. So British power is built on coal. And this coal-fired empire extends itself through the Mediterranean and North Africa, through South into Southeast Asia. It was powered, and it's very crucial, not just by coal, but by human muscle. Prior to fossil fuels, our sources of energy, the human sources of energy, came from human muscle and animal muscle power. To some extent, they came from wind and falling water. But human muscle power was crucial, remember, in wars. In the First World War and the Second World War, the side which won was the one which had more energy supplies. One of the reasons for the defeat of the Germans when they went into the Soviet Union and overextended across Europe is that they were running out of oil. What is not often known is that even as late as 1941, the largest invasion in human history, 3 million men crossing the borders, 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's audacious attempt, which failed to conquer the Soviet Union, Russia in particular. They had 3 million men, and please don't forget, 750,000 horses. And anyone who reads the stories of the Eastern Front, the stories of human suffering, are equally matched by animal suffering. So horses remained very important in European economies even as late as the 1940s. In the United States, there were more horses being used in the 1920s than there had been in the 1880s. One of the reasons is this technological transformation wasn't absolute. Coal coming in did not mean the end of human muscle power and animal muscle power. They continued for a while. Oil comes in a very major way from the early 20th century. The British Empire, as we know, faded after 1945. It took a lot of hard knocks in the First and Second World War. And the sun began to set on Britannia, and Britannia ceased to rule the waves somewhere in the 1940s. So the coming of independence to India and Pakistan, a year later to Bangladesh and to Sri Lanka and Burma, would be followed by the retreat of the British Empire from large parts of Africa, particularly in the 1960s and eventually in the 70s. But from the First World War on, we get a new very important power, which has a much larger environmental footprint. The remarkable work on it by Richard Tucker, the title itself is beautiful. It's called Insatiable Appetite. Now, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with American products: hamburgers, chewing gum, tinned fruit, cocoa. Yes, the Americans also consume cocoa, coffee, tea. This book shows how the tropical world is transformed by this enormous American appetite. In the 20s, the symbol of American life would become the first mass-produced motor vehicle in history, which was affordable at a price which the middle class could aspire to, the Model T Ford. Anyone and everyone here probably has used some motor transport to come here. Well, I'm not a great fan of Henry Ford. He's not a very nice man, is he? But sometimes people who are not nice leave a mark in our lives. The basic design of the car you and I came in is based on him. It's got an axle, it's got wheels, it's got an internal combustion engine. And the rubber for those tires came from West Africa, particularly from Liberia. And the rubber was made into tires by a Firestone company. If Americans went into the supermarket, they would buy bananas. United States doesn't grow bananas. Small number in Florida, not the ones they like. It was the Honduras, which was run largely by the United Fruit Company. So the United States pioneers a new kind of domination, which is empire without colonies. And it's very crucial that between 1908 and 68, US consumption of oil, the extent to which the American economy is dependent on oil, goes from 8 to 68%. So if Britain was the first coal-fired global empire, the United States was the first oil-fired global empire. I repeat, there was nothing preordained about these countries coming here. With some changes in our narrative, what applied to the Industrial Revolution in England could apply to parts of Scandinavia, could apply to Germany, could apply to France, and could eventually apply to Russia and parts of Eastern Europe. Japan was a latecomer in the 1870s to the Industrial Revolution. One of the very important features about the Industrial Revolution is that it opened up a yawning gap between the countries which were industrialized and those that were not. One of the advantages of studying in Oxford is I had a very interesting college supervisor who went by the rather unlikely surname of Darwin. And he got fed up of students asking him, are you actually related to Charles Darwin? And before you completed, he'd say, yes, I'm his great grandson, but I'm not interested in biology. And he often quoted a very interesting ditty, which the British liked in Africa. It said, we have the Maxim gun and they don't. I'm sure you've heard this. The Maxim gun was an automatic repeater gun. But quite aside from that, I think the control of the trade routes of the seas was to be of enormous significance. Look at two very interesting reasons. In the 17th century, the first major sugar plantations are set up in Jamaica. Now, Jamaica, to those who are lovers of cricket, was the home of the great Sir Garfield Sobers. And Jamaica, of course, is famous not for sugar, but another product which sugar helps to make, rum. But the West Indies and the Caribbean, they found very soon, could not support sugar without slaves. And in this period, you start the beginnings of a vast slave trade from West Africa, which involves 9 to 10 million people being shipped from West Africa to the Americas. Initially the Caribbean, then parts of Latin America, and you got it, the southern United States, which was importing slaves to as late as the 1800s. All those wonderful cotton mills of Manchester and Lancashire. One of the things I recall of my school days, which Harini fortunately didn't talk about, is that in the 1970s, we went to a very nice mystery school where, among other things, there were things which are now exterminated, thank God, like caning, hitting with a ruler, and we actually had a teacher who specialized in throwing dusters at us. I'm happy to say she always missed because we ducked before the duster hit us. I sometimes wonder what if the duster had actually hit one of us. I'm afraid we lived in a day when our parents might have said that, you must have done something naughty. I'm sure it's not the teacher's fault. It's a very different world in the 21st century, and thank our stars for that. But one of the things I remember about geography lessons with Mrs. Nazareth, God bless her soul, is that she always said, don't believe what's written in the textbooks about Lancashire. Lancashire was not a center of cotton manufacturing because it was damp and it was easy to weave it. It was important because they got cheap cotton. They got the cotton cheap from countries to which they sold the textiles. And one of the places they got the cotton cheap, not to be forgotten, was what is today the United States of America. The United States of America, particularly the South, so important in American politics today, was a source of raw cotton which was grown by slaves. Now, we all know in the 1860s, there was the American Civil War. Lincoln led the Union to its victory and to the emancipation of the slaves. What you may not know, and as a historian I should bring out, is that that period, 1860 to 65, was an incredible heaven-sent opportunity for cultivators, farmers, traders, transporters across Western India. This is a period when there was a huge expansion of the acreage of cotton. It was possible to export cotton from India to England. And this raw material brought back lots of money. So there's something called the cotton boom. And many of the families which went into industry later made money in the cotton boom. As with all booms, it ended. It ended because once the Civil War was over, the supplies resumed. And it was possible to get American cotton to the British manufacturers, and Indian cotton went through a downslide. I'm emphasizing this because I was very struck. Professor Nagendra referred to three major changes: the collapse of biodiversity, the expansion of chemical contamination and pollution, and climate change. You find all of these beginning to be very significant in the 19th century for the first time on a global scale. And the British Empire plays a very critical role in enabling the unification of markets across the world. Britain ruled, one tends to forget, 25% of the land area of the earth. As of 1918, it was the largest empire the world had ever seen, which was reasonably stable for 50, 100, 150 years, depending how you count it. Within this empire, it's very crucial. It was possible to move commodities around, even to places which were formerly not part of the empire. The other major transformation comes about from the 1840s. Britain, along with other countries, was very upset with the Qing rulers of China, who were shutting out and trying to stamp down something as pernicious as the drug trade, the opium trade. Those of you who are familiar with the remarkable trilogy of the great Amitav Ghosh, it's a remarkable book, The River of Fire, and he shows us the significance of merchants. One of them is a very important Indian Parsi merchant, of course a fictional character, who are deeply invested in the trade. So there's opium grown in India, taken into China. Opium is a remarkable product because supply creates demand. And China creates, or they assist in the creation in China of the world's largest population ever of drug addicts. And the Chinese government comes in and tries to stop it. There are a series of wars, 2 huge wars, the opium wars. The Chinese market is opened up. But just keep an eye on this, the triangular trade. Indian opium marketed in China, taken by British ships, British insurance companies. The Chinese tea taken to Britain. Kappa tea, that's where it began. It began earlier, but it became popular then. And the same ships come back to India with British manufacturers. Now it's very, very critical. This period of the 18th, 19th century, the pivot of the world transforms. And the transformation of that pivot was not because of the inventiveness, the genius, the enterprise, the technology, none of it should be denied, of a handful of Northern European countries. It was also because many of these countries control the terms of trade with others. That figure, 1700, Indian textiles, remarkable new work by Prasanna Parthasarathi with the title which I would kill for, there's no point because you can't do that, and he's written the book anyway, and none of us knows enough to write that book, do we? It's called Why Europe Got Rich and Asia Did Not. It's a one-line argument. Perhaps he exaggerates, but why not? It is that tariff controls came in as early as the 1720s, 30s, 40s, preventing Indian textiles from entering European markets. And the tariffs which could have assisted India from the 1760s went down as Britain took control of larger parts of India. So this yawning gap which we get, India, China, Asia with Europe, actually opens up in the 19th century. Now, how is all this possibly important to climate change? Let me go back to 1972. I began by saying that there were only 2 heads of government who were present. One was the Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme. Socialist. Sweden had not fought in the First or the Second World Wars. The last time Sweden fought in a war was in 1711. And believe it or not, they invaded Russia. It's a very vast empire, the Swedes. What they are today is a shadow of their former self. Sweden in the 1970s had for many years a social democratic government which boasted some of the finest welfare regimes on earth. It's the only country, first country in the world, by the way, where not only women get leave when the baby is born. But the Swedish had a sub-clause which says the man on paternity leave, if they don't do housework properly, you can be reported, can not only be called back to work, but they can dock the pay which they gave you. This is very interesting. And Palme's Sweden was a country where the environment and nature were very important to the notion of a Swedish identity. Sweden had distinguished itself by staying away from the Great Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, did not join either military bloc. For many years, it was one of the very few European countries which supported the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. The other leader was Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and her speech is very relevant to the big debate on climate change today. She argued in her speech that poverty is the greatest polluter. Now, this statement is often taken out of context and used to argue that, the Prime Minister of India said poverty is the greatest polluter. She did. But if you look at the whole of that passage, she goes on to argue, how can you protect a forest and the animals that live within it if the people who live on its fringes come in conflict with those animals? The only way to conserve the forest, she argued, was to bring those people aboard. Now, these are not policies she always adhered to, but for once she was saying the right thing. She further went on to take a stand on something of enormous significance in the climate change debate and in the environmental debates of the 1970s. What was at the root of the environmental crisis? The answer was simple, according to many scholars in the West, 2 of whom stand out for the title of their book, The Population Bomb. Paul and Anne Ehrlich, very great scholars. They later revised their views, and all credit to them. They argued that the problem of the environment was an issue of population. Ehrlich had gone so far as to write in his book that he went to the streets of Kolkata to such an offensive paragraph, it was deleted by his publishers later. And he said, wherever I looked, there were people, population, 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 and so on and so forth. So Mrs. Gandhi took this view head on and argued that the citizen of a North American or European country consumes far more energy, has a much larger impact on the global environment than a citizen of a developing country. And she went on to say that the developing countries did value the environment. But in order to tackle the issues of the environment, they needed access to modern science, modern technology, and to the funds to tackle this crisis. She was not alone. The Chinese, who at that time did not have very good relations with India, we did not even have diplomatic relations, the Chinese delegate made an even more interesting statement. It's a very oft-quoted statement. Like a lot of things the Chinese say, it's a parable. You can read whatever you want into it, but I'll share it with you. It said, of all things, people are the most precious. There's something very significant happening here. The developed and the developing world were not dividing on ideological lines of capitalism and communism. It was not between democratic government and one-party state. It was not between the market economy and the planned economy. It was not the Cold War kind of divide. It was what would come to be called the North-South divide. And one of the dimensions of the North-South divide is the developed world argued that the root of the problem is population growth. And no prizes for guessing, 40% of the people who live on the earth are in China and India. South Asia, that is the SAARC countries, have more people than China. For historical reasons, which I can't go into, the valleys of the Huanghe, the Yangtze Kiang, the Mekong, Brahmaputra, Ganga, Indus are the most densely populated places on earth, for reasons I can't get into right now. But what it ignored is that the environmental footprint of a human being depends on who they are, where they are, and what they do. To paraphrase from the great Amartya Sen famously would argue in the 80s that famines do not occur because of a shortage of food. There may be a shortage of food, but there are famines which have occurred when there's an abundance of food. He said the problem is the absence of entitlement. And he presented, remarkably shown in the great Bangla film, which I urge all of you to see, at least the opening sequences, they're very difficult to watch, Akaler Shandhaner, The Sound of Famine, which shows a beautiful Bengal countryside, butterflies flitting around, a bumper harvest, and people starving to death because they didn't have the money to get to the food. Also, the food was shipped off for the war effort. And there were traders who were making money, and it was British policy. But to come back, the environmental footprint of different human beings is uneven, and of different states is uneven. And one of the great changes of the 20th century, which we're all aware of, I referred to the end of the British Empire, is the number of nation states on earth went up. So in the 20th century, the number of people on earth went up fourfold. But the earth is a unified ecological system. It's not a unified political system. Everybody anywhere on earth lives within something called a nation state. Or you live in an area claimed by more than one nation state. Or you live inside a nation state among a group of people who want to be another nation state. I can go on and on. But the world, at least the terrestrial area, the land surface, that 30%, is divided into nation states. There are 4 times as many nation states today as in 2014. But they are unequal. They are unequal in their economic size. In 1945, when the Second World War ended, the United States accounted for 40 to 45% of the gross world product. It had emerged largely unscathed through the Second World War. The only part of the United States which suffered direct assault, as we all know, was Pearl Harbor, 7 December 1941. Philippines, which was effectively a protectorate of the United States, though nominally independent. By contrast, Europe was ravaged. Much of the Soviet Union was ravaged. 27 million dead. China was ravaged, 14 million dead. We don't think about it, but Indians, 2.5 million fought in the war, 2.2 million to be precise. By the way, 3,000 elephants also served in the Allied forces in East Asia under the command of the redoubtable Lord Mountbatten, though it's not in his memoirs. Remember, those animals are still important. But I think at the end of the Second World War, the United States stood at the pinnacle of its power. It was challenged, but it was economically enormously significant. 30 years ago, we went through another moment, the end of the so-called Cold War. I say so-called because during the Cold War, there was no direct armed conflict in Europe and North America and some parts of the alliance areas such as Japan, Australia, New Zealand. In the rest of the world, there were many wars. There are various estimates in the Cold War of how many people died. But at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed, China got caught up in the Tiananmen Square in the systemic crisis. It looked like one side had won. It was clear who lost, but nobody was very clear who won. And I am very struck that it's around the time of the end of the Cold War that environmental consciousness came back with a new surge. There was a great environmental awakening across the world in the late 1960s. There was concern about ecocide in Vietnam. There was concern across the world about population growth. There was concern about chemical contamination. The Stockholm Conference, even though it did not bring many heads of state, it brought many ministers together. It led to the creation of the UN Environment Program. In much of the developing world, there were new kinds of assertions. In India, there was the Chipko Andolan. There was a very important movement which was brewing in southern India, which would culminate in the struggle to save Silent Valley. There were counterparts in many other countries. But in the late 1980s and early 90s, a new kind of concern emerged. And I think it's very important to remember this, that the insights of the sciences, which had been growing in the post-war period, actually acquired planetary voice and forum. They were not new. They were earlier voices. There's the remarkable work in 1962 of Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, where she talked about the petrochemical revolution and argued that technology was largely linear. It was trying to solve problems by taking them apart. It was not looking at its own implications. She famously argued that it would be a tragedy if a mindless chemical technology, which was unleashed on a few insects, would end up pitting us against the earth itself. It's a remarkable phrase of hers, and every student who reads it comes back and say, I didn't know scientists could write so well. And of course, you say she's a rare creature of both the world of the sciences and the literary crafts and arts. It was Barry Commoner in the early 70s who argued, again, that technology tended to be reductionist, and he argued from a holistic view. I think by the end of the 80s, there was enough evidence coming together, which led to the UN Framework on Climate Change, 1994. Note the date, a year before Paul Crutzen, 1995. So we are today in a period when there has been almost 3 decades of debate on the question of climate change. And the question of climate change cannot be regarded as separate from the larger question of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, just to go back, is a time when humans acquire the power of a geological force to transform the life systems of the earth. I want to emphasize this a little carefully. We're not talking about the survival of the planet. The planet is 4 billion years old. It will outlast whatever folly or games humans may play. We are talking about life systems on the planet. The life systems on the planet consist not just of the atmosphere, the lithosphere, the hydrosphere. Hope I haven't left anything out. Well, I have, haven't I? The atmosphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere also consist of its diverse life forms. There are various estimates. How many life forms are there on Earth? Earlier they said 1 million, then they said 5 million, then they said 10 million. The wag in me says, hey, but you just told me there's a biodiversity crisis, but you guys are keeping on discovering new species every day. I was horrified to read in a book by E.O. Wilson, and my students are even more horrified. In a book of his on page 2 or 3, he says life exists everywhere. Brace yourself. There are 14 species of mites which live under our eyelashes. But I think this great dying, this snapping of the various links on the earth was also part of this economic and political transformation. I'm sure all of you have heard about the biodiversity crisis, but I'm sure even your best friends have seen one of the versions of Jurassic Park. It's a very famous film. It's even been made in Tamil and Telugu and Mandarin. And I think it's done more to popularize dinosaurs than all the work done by paleontologists. It's a different matter where how accurate it is. But it's significant that the idea of Jurassic Park, extinct species coming back to life, is so popular in art, culture, cinema. I meet 3-year-olds who are quite amused that I don't know the full form of T-Rex. And they tell me, Uncle, it's called a dinosaur. And of course, when I ask them, what does it do? They all roar at the top of their voice and I pretend to be scared, and then they do it again and again and again and again. But isn't it paradoxical? We're so fascinated with creatures long extinct, just at the time when we're living through probably the largest episode of extinctions which has occurred in many epochs. There have been 5 major extinctions. We're probably living through the 6th. Many of these extinctions also were powered not just by population growth, but by specific economic, technological, and capital transformations. One of the big transformations, very difficult for us to grasp, is what has happened to the world's oceans. Between 1500 and 1800, and again 1800 to around 1970s, so vast hunting of the greatest mammals that have ever existed in human history, the whales. Many of them were just hunted out. By the 1970s, it was possible to open a Time magazine and mug up. It's nice, those days we liked mugging up things. Before the internet, everyone was very impressed. Now nobody is. They just pop up and say, hey, you got it wrong. It said, do you know that 3 whales are killed every hour? And I think this huge transformation of whale blubber into industrial product, I emphasize, was part of the manner in which the oceans were tapped for this huge economic expansion. The other, which is well known, is the great onslaught on the forests of the world, particularly after 1945. This, of course, gathered a lot of force during the Second World War and took on more later. So where are we today then? I began by saying that history will help us to know where we are, why we're here, and it might give us an idea of where we ought to go. And there will be differences on where we ought to go, and much more than that, on how we ought to get there. So the nations of the world, which agreed to prevent the scourge of war, have succeeded in preventing another nuclear war. It's not a minor accomplishment. Another nuclear war would have led to the annihilation of civilization as we know it. And since the environmental crisis is all often about despair, desolation, bad news, let me share some good news. One of the great changes between 1987 and now is that 85 to 87% of the nuclear weapons on Earth have been decommissioned. The end of the Cold War led to a historic pact between the United States, Soviet Union, later Russia, which they have so far held to. So it's a very important transformation. The other is that the same year, 1987, was the year of the Montreal Protocol. One of the great changes in the Anthropocene, brought about to a large extent by refrigeration, is the release of a very important greenhouse gas, a set of greenhouse gases known as chlorofluorocarbons. It's a very complicated word. We'll just call it CFCs. Well, the CFC is 24 times more serious in terms of driving up heat than carbon dioxide. Good news. Between 1987 and now, the ozone hole in the ozone layer in the North and South Pole have both closed because there was unprecedented cooperation between the United States and the rest of the world, driven by a major American company which had the technology, DuPont, normally one of the bad guys in environmental stories, but in this case it aligned with the Republican Party, Ronald Reagan, International Science, and they managed to both transfer technology and share the cash. This, however, has not proved possible, I want to emphasize, with climate change. Here, there are fundamental divisions between developed and developing countries, between those who export fossil fuels and import them, those who have the technologies and those who don't. Over the last 50 years, and going back to the energy crisis of 73, one of the big debates has been, how can we move from the fossil fuel age to the solar age? I have to share with you a joke from Pun. One dinosaur asked another, what comes after death? And the other said, didn't you know? Petroleum. So I think it's very important. The coal and the oil is the result of not to be repeated geological processes. So fossil fuels are also solar powered, but it's packed solar energy. It's something like a vitamin capsule. You know, when you were small, you were asked to have lots of vitamin capsules. Sometimes you went overboard and ate 10 of them, not knowing it's bad for you. Something like that. The release of the chemical compounds embodied in the fossil fuels has happened at such an incredible rate that 75 to 80% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have been released after 1945. There are estimates that half is since 1990. How do you get off the train? Well, there's two bits of good news. First, all the nations of the world agree that we need to get off the train. Second, the major economies, the United States, China, Europe, India, I may have left one or two out, have pledged dates by which they will get to net zero. There are various dates, 2050, 2060, 2070. And now comes the interesting part. Nobody is quite sure how to get there. Because there is a conflict between state interests, individual states, and the common interest of humanity. The state system drives countries to compete with each other. In the past, they competed for how large their armies would be. You know the famous Hindi film Sholay, the most incredible dialogue ever in a Hindi film, Kitne aadmi the? How many men did you have? Or how many men did he have? Has been replaced by Kitna koila hai? How much coal do they have? How much oil do they have? How much gas do they have? The other is, this is not simply a problem of technology or a problem of finance. It's also a problem of the way of thinking. If you think of the earth as a living system, which makes peoples, countries, states interdependent on each other, it's impossible to hive off the economic activities that sustain life, livelihood, and even wealth creation and distribution from ecological processes. Think of the last few months. Think of the floods in Bengaluru, the enormous glacial burst in Pakistan, the dry spells in Russia, Ukraine, and parts of the American Midwest, the unseasonal, sharp, heavy rains which have devastated crops for the third year in a row in parts of Maharashtra and the first time in many years in parts of North India. So these changes are part of what is happening in the global system. But what we know about the past is this: change happens when there is enough pressure, enough popular concern to drive those who are powerful to act. That is how the changes of the 20th century came about. Women moving towards equal rights in society. The idea of people of different genders being equal human beings. The idea that there would be equality irrespective of race, caste, creed, color, the shape or size of your nose, how you cut your hair, who you prayed to or did not pray. The fact that every people had the right to determine their own future. These are not things which could be taken for granted. They came about through enormous public debate, upheaval, and struggle. What does it mean when we take that logic to the idea of a peace with nature? Does it mean equality beyond humanity? Does it mean equality beyond today's generation to the future? Whose generation are we talking about? A 60-year-old human lifespan? Or believe it or not, the Atlantic bowhead whale, which by the way lives 250 years. There could have been a whale which was coasting around in 1780s who was still gamboling around in the Arctic Ocean. When we think of these timescales, there's an enormity of it that comes upon us. But the reverse is very crucial. Environmental transformation has been driven by a combination of scientific insight into how nature works, public and popular concern, and public action. And that combination is vital. How do we get there? What do we do? That is a wonderful subject, but it's time to end and maybe reserve that for another talk.
That's all for this episode. We hope that you had a great time listening and learning. Follow Podcast Azim Premji University on Spotify and YouTube podcasts for all upcoming episodes in this series.